Welcome back, everybody, after this really inspiring talk by Jean-Claude Pires. And we did expect that, but it was wonderful, as usual with him, very specific. But as he said at the end, of course, he didn't talk much about external differentiation. So this is the idea today, that we move on to a roundtable, really around Brexit, but Brexit in comparison. And really try to wrap our heads around the different models of differentiated integration or disintegration out there with four wonderful speakers. Meltem Müftüler-Baç from Sabancı. Everybody knows John Erik from Arena, Oslo, Christian Frommelt from Liechtenstein Institut, and Nanette Neuwahl from University of Montréal. And the way we've kind of conceived of this roundtable is that I will ask three questions to our four roundtable members. They don't all have to answer every question, but so we can go step by step in this conversation, if that's okay with everyone. So the first question I would like to ask you is simply to ask, well, now that the UK is out and building in a dynamic way its own model of differentiated integration externally, which model out there is most similar both to what we see today, but also would be preferred by different actors in this game? And including, if you can, think about Scotland or different nations within the UK itself. So relevance of existing models to where we are and where we're going for the UK. So who would like to start? Meltem, maybe? How about the Turkish model?
Okay, thank you, Kalypso. No problem. I'd love to start. Well, thanks a lot for all the questions in any case. To be specific with the first question, which is that, you said which model would be most similar for the British example in the future. I don't think Turkey would be the answer to that. And we have an hour to go in detail on it, but let me just make a few points and then I'll pass the floor to my other colleagues. The Turkish example is one where we actually see a non-member, European country that's trying to become a member of the European Union for the past, now almost 60 years. Give and take everything that built upon the original association agreement of 1963. But from a distance, the Brexit decision also turned out to be, for the current Turkey-EU relations, some kind of a blessing in disguise, because now Turkey and the UK are designing their own free trade agreements. They just signed one at the end of December, which became more or less operational a few months ago, that went much beyond the original customs union agreement that Turkey has with the European Union, because it included agricultural products as well. So to be very specific, when we look into the Turkish model, what does Turkey-EU relations tell us with regards to the future of British and EU relations? I'd say probably not much, except the fact that there might be a few lessons that, to have a trade integration with the European Union without appropriate dispute settlement mechanisms turned out to be a problem in the Turkish case. So for the UK and the EU economic integration model for the future, I think one of the most important things that might need to be contemplated or decided upon is having a dispute resolution mechanism. And that's also part of if the customs union modernization could have been launched when it was originally suggested in 2016, that is incorporated into the revitalization of the customs union with Turkey, but it still, is frozen. So that would be one lesson. And the second thing would be probably to look into what Turkey is actually doing, which is voluntarily opting in beyond what is required parallel to its candidacy and accession process, voluntarily opting into multiple EU policies. But for the British case, Britain is already in most of them, and it's now opting out or had opted out. So the way that Turkish concerns about, let's say, security and migration are now playing out in Turkey-EU relations could be seen as premonitions, as some kind of a warning as to what might happen with the UK and EU as well. So what is important for Turkey in its relations with the EU, trade, security, migration, are also the same type of issues that are important for the United Kingdom. And these are where still, the exact modalities in the Turkish case are not working very properly. So that might actually be, something to take into consideration in designing the EU-UK model. So I'll stop here.
Thank you, Meltem. Warning, not model, warning. So Nanette, what about from your viewpoint? No, you're muted.
Thank you, Kalypso. I will not say anything about the different actors, especially on the side of the UK. I think there are better people qualified to answer the part on the receptiveness of the different actors in the UK to the agreements reached. This is a matter of domestic politics, devolution of powers, and ultimately United Kingdom constitutional law. I will also not comment on Northern Ireland. It's clear that the situation of Northern Ireland, which is regulated in the protocol attached to the 2019 withdrawal agreement, is quite unique to the UK-EU relations. I would comment rather in general on the trade and cooperation agreement agreed in December 2020. And I believe that the Canada model is the most similar for a number of reasons. First of all, it is a deep trade agreement, meaning essentially, to be brief, that it goes beyond the elimination of obstacles to goods crossing frontiers, and it comprises regulatory cooperation. Secondly, it covers a great deal of policy areas and a significant portion of the parties' GNP. Thirdly, it contributes to a rules-based international trading order, especially in the relationships between the parties, but not only. Fourthly, it provides an institutional structure, or institutional structures, I should say, allowing for timely information between parties and for effective dispute settlement between parties, even if the UK-EU relationship and agreement is still in development. And also, fifthly, the Canada type agreement is a mega regional one, which preserves the freedom of parties to legislate, and this is essentially what the United Kingdom got. There are, of course, differences between Canada and the UK's agreement or agreements. However, the dispute settlement provisions of both agreements are quite sophisticated and much more refined than in the context of the WTO. The UK's dispute settlement mechanisms are designed to minimize countermeasures in case of objectionable legislation by the other party. And the ones in the Canada relationship do not do that, although they are sophisticated as well. I just put it this year for a discussion, perhaps later. Thank you.
Thank you, Nanette. And indeed, the Canada model has been such a focal point in the whole conversation. Canada plus or minus was a leitmotif, of course, of the Brexit conversation. So you tend to basically echo, I guess, Brexiters who are always, all we want is a Canada model. So more or less, that's what Britain got, is what we're hearing from you with differences. So I want to turn now to John Erik. John Erik, who we are together in the EUD3. And of course, he's been leading this conference and the whole DiCE enterprise. So John Erik, give us your take on this question.
Thanks. Well, I think Nanette is right. But it's not only a question of models, I mean, in terms of formal agreements, but it's also the question of the politics. And of course, if you look at the current governments, let's say in Norway versus the UK, the political objectives are quite different. In that, of course, the UK wants to separate. So it wants to a system that manages diversity or its divergence from the EU, basically, whereas Norway's government, and actually of more or less all stripes, has been to get as close a relationship to the EU as possible to reduce uncertainty. So the political objectives are quite different. And also, of course, the formal arrangement, as Nanette was saying, is of course much less comprehensive in the trade and cooperation agreement than the EEA, which is marked by dynamic homogeneity, and where the Court of Justice where the EU law actually has direct effect in Norway and the EEA countries. So this is quite a different situation. The dynamic adaptation built into the arrangement itself. What strikes me though is whether we could still see when the dust settles a bit in the UK, something similar to the Swiss autonome Nachvollzug on the ground in the UK. So the question is also below the political surface and the political skirmishes and the political conflicts, to what extent there is an ongoing adaptation in a more invisible manner in those areas that are not being politicized. So I'm wondering if this type of dynamic also unfolds. In addition, there also are forces in the UK that are more interested in a more binding commitment or arrangement with the EU, and Scotland is certainly one of them, and has tried through legislation also to mimic EU law as much as possible, because EU law was regulating devolved competences in Scotland. Now, this hinges also, of course, on the process of devolution itself. And Brexit is in this sense so far more of a centralizing issue that Michael Keating has written about, and devolution itself is also at stake in relation to Brexit. It's kind of ironic that the idea was to take back control, but it has been more to the executive than to the parliament or the people in the UK thus far. Thanks.
Well, thank you, John Erik. And actually what you said leads me directly to our second question, and I'm going to turn to Christian here. As John Erik just said, at the end of the day, Brexit and Britain are complete outliers, a case of disintegration, managed divergence, and as a centrifugal really exception to all of the EU's external relations. That's what it looks like on paper. But then the question is, do we find other instances of resistance to convergence elsewhere? Whether in terms of the domestic political pressures in that third country on the part of the EU, is that kind of contrast so much black and white? Could there be contagions between third countries in this regard, that of managing some elements of divergence, even though that might be resisted by the EU? So Christian, let us know.
Thank you very much. I just would like to say something to the first question. In my view, we have to be a bit careful, because you have already mentioned it, black and white, and also regarding those models, especially when we look to the institutions, though those models are not that clear. I think in the EA and in the Swiss EU model, you can really see that different institutional procedures and institutions mix up over time. They haven't been seen or foreseen at the very beginning of the model, but then have been introduced over time, and so there is some kind of a mixture up. And I think that this will also happen to the UK-EU relationship, that new institutional procedures will come up and will be inspired from the different models. But coming back to your second questions, I think external differentiated integration is always about managing diversity and heterogeneity, and this diversity or heterogeneity, this does not diminish. It's still there. It might be less salient, but it's still there, and it still determines the relationship between the EFTA states and the EU. And I think interesting for me is really this distinction a bit between disintegration and centrifugal effects that we have also discussed a bit before. And in the case of the EA, you hardly find any example for disintegration. There might be one case where you really have disintegration, because in former times the EFTA states participated in all EU programs, but since 2014 they only participate in the EU programs very selectively. So you have some EU programs where all EFTA states participate, and some which are EA related, which only 1 or 2 states participate. And the EU has allowed that, and it was quite surprising that the EU allowed that. And as soon as the EU has allowed that, the EFTA states have taken this opportunity. Because sometimes those programs are quite costly, and that's why Norway is not participating in some programs, and also Iceland, and especially Liechtenstein. And then centrifugal effects, so this is another issue, another term that we have discussed before, and this is something which is very, very typical for external differentiated integration in my case, in my view, and especially in the EA. And for me, it's actually impossible that external differentiated integration can keep up with the legislative dynamics of the European integration. And that's why there is kind of always something like widening a gap between the EU and the EAFTA states or Switzerland, those 2 models with which I am familiar, but then also closing it again. To give an example, in the case of the EA, there has been the incorporation of the participation of the EAFTA states in the European system of financial supervision was delayed, and with that, the incorporation of hundreds of EU acts in financial services were delayed. In that case, it was only about institutional questions, but there are other cases where it was more about political questions. But for a long, it was just a single EU act which has blocked the entire integration in a policy field. And as soon as this blockage could be solved, then there was this closing of the gap again. But it's kind of this dynamic that we have, and those centrifugal effects, which are somehow also motivated by domestic opposition, but sometimes also just institutional questions. And this is quite a challenge also for external differentiated integration.
Well, thank you, Christian, and for this distinction. Yes, that is very useful. We're not talking disintegration, but there are patterns of centrifugal, centripetal, and do we see? So, who else would like to comment on that potential for centrifugal forces from other examples? And of course, Christian, you were so right to point out what we all know studying differentiated integration. Every model is idiosyncratic and has its own life over time, even inside the EEA. Meltem, would you like to come back on
Can
this?
I just add something here? I think we also need to take into account the fact that politics matter significantly in shaping the exact modalities of whatever relationship we're looking into. And it's something that was alluded by both John Erik and Jean-Claude Piri before, that you cannot think about, or we cannot think about integration, external or internal differentiation without looking into the domestic political ramifications. And I think the Turkish example and looking into the debates that are happening inside the United Kingdom could actually, they could overlap in terms of identifying how there are all these multiple political forces that are, shaping both the political rhetoric at the elite level, but also impacting and providing cues to the masses to look into the European Union in some form of a fashion, which in return becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy of its own, pulling states apart from a more integrated project. That's what I just wanted to add to this discussion for now.
But of course, we could ask whether these political matters are exogenous, they're whatever that country is going through at that moment, or whether they're also endogenous to how well the two sides are managing the relationship, and including what the EU does. And Nanette, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, but yeah, thank you. But before answering that, I would like to look a little bit into the question: what is in what way the trade and cooperation agreement between the EU and the UK is an example of disintegration and managed divergence, and then the question to what extent it may be an outlier. Now, this has been dealt with in an article by Daniel Collins, an article in Politeia in December 2020. And he remarks that the TCA is a treaty for divergence, and he explains that. So this treaty is not necessarily coaxing parties into convergence, quite the opposite. Although there is a fear for social dumping and undercutting, the treaty is quite permissive towards divergence. The bar for protective measures against social dumping is quite high. It allows countermeasures only in case of significant divergence accompanied by material damage after it has happened, and this damage must be proven by facts and not conjecture. That is quite more demanding than the WTO system. Moreover, the party who finds a measure by the other party unacceptable will not be able to obtain the adaptation of the measure. It can just impose tariffs. And the reaction to the measures, the tariffs, must be proportional, they must be time limited, they must be restricted to what is strictly necessary. And this is then subject to institutionalized arbitration. And then finally, the overuse of retaliation by tariffs may trigger a review of the level playing field provisions of the TCA altogether. So this is what is meant by managed divergence. It does not manage the harmonization, but it manages the reaction to divergence. I suspect that these arrangements are quite unique. At any rate, it is quite possible for the EU to argue that these arrangements are a one-off. They are acceptable only in case of outgoing member states, because it may want to do so as they tie the hands of the EU. So I think the EU will not extend the privilege to any other state who is already perfectly aligned. We can think, of course, of the EEA and Turkey, as my colleagues here point out. To some extent, they are aligned and they have a choice already. But in any case, they are not on the EU's priority list for changes, because they already have agreements that do not include such provisions. So I think it's not a case of extending the privilege to other parties. And this is not just a question of unwillingness. There is also the question of the exception to the WTO's most favored nation principle. The exception to the most favored nation principle is available only to integration projects, like customs unions or previously non-existent free trade areas. In order for it to continue to be available in a reverse situation, it may be required that new obstacles to trade accompanying the exit of a member state are exceptional, and that they do not, in particular, that they do not harm the interests of other WTO states. Although the EU-UK TCA states in Article other 3 that the agreement is conform the WTO, this has not been confirmed in the framework of the WTO. It is in fact uncharted water. And in view of this uncertainty, the negotiation of such diversification mechanisms will not be a priority for the European Union. In reply to your question, therefore, I would say that the TCA closely resembles the Canada relationship, but that it can also be seen as a new model that may come in handy in case another member state decides to leave the EU.
Well, thank you, Nanette. And this kind of pointing out of the exceptional allowance for some divergence, including in LPF, under the procedures that you point out, highly constrains the question that we posed. To what extent can the other agreements be flexible enough to allow for some centrifugal, some divergence? And you're saying, not really. This is not a precedent. John Erik.
Thanks. I'd like to complement that with the political dynamics of this, because if you look at, if you look at all the affiliations in all the states, there are minorities that are against the current arrangement, against the status quo. You see this across the EFTA states, and of course in EU member states. Now, the motivations can be summed up maybe under three headings: identity, of course, cost benefits of the current versus an alternative arrangement, and also risk and uncertainty. So of changing the affiliation. So that takes us also to the type of mechanisms that these states have, these states have to maintain the current status quo. And what you find, for instance, in the Norway case is that there are explicit political mechanisms in the system, among the political parties in the system, to depoliticize the affiliation, and of course to keep away the whole EU membership from put a lid on this, so that it allows for an ongoing adaptation. Now, this is also a fragile arrangement, and then it's particularly so in Norway because it has also retained a traditional understanding of sovereignty that the UK is now trying to get back to. But the calculus of people in this, it depends very much also on the question of cost benefits that can be clearly discerned when you have relatively stable relations, whereas risk uncertainty comes up the more these issues are politicized and the more uncertain they are. So as of now, my sense is that uncertainty guides the calculus, so that the idea of making a clear calculus of cost and benefits of the UK and its Brexit is premature in this case, and it doesn't actually figure very highly because people are much more, and governments and so on, are much more conditioned towards risk and uncertainty. The question is if the UK relationship stabilizes, and then what we get, and in this case, insofar as the UK government is able to push the traditional notion of sovereignty, it can drive and use the identitarian dimension, and this can again then be given momentum across. So what I'm trying to say is that also these affiliations that are not membership are also precarious in certain ways. One thing lies in the resilience of these arrangements, but as Christian also was saying, there is a lot of flexibility in these, and they have been pushed in different directions. So the question, of course, is how resilient they are if you get different types of political mobilizations. And you see different forces, for instance, in Norway, that are interested in changing the status quo.
I mean, indeed, John Erik, you echoing also Meltem, you point out the political sociology of all this and whether societies in third countries will sustain the agreement. And with our third round, I'd like to take us all the way back then to how the outside in works, how these arrangements may affect what happens inside the EU itself. Because we could argue that what you're pointing out is different degrees by which the relationship negotiated with these countries leaves that political space to manage people's identity, cost benefit, risk assessments, etc. So somehow it's that fine line between enough flexibility to sustain public opinion behind these agreements. But at the same time, of course, the question for you is to what extent the EU will resist that dynamic under, accusation of cherry picking and being better off outside with this differentiation, especially if we haven't reached the stage that Jean-Claude Piris was giving us earlier of a kind of organized, differentiated integration inside the EU. So aren't we entering a kind of turbulent phase where basically the EU might resist these special arrangements that are customized through differentiation, or on the contrary, now, do you see that this space is going to be maintained? So this is our last round, and we would like short answers because we want to go to Q&A. Who would like to go first?
Can I do that very quickly, Kalypso?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Sorry. Okay, both of you raised their hands. Okay, go ahead, Meltem.
Very quickly. The EU cannot, enlarge and continue expanding forever. So I think this is actually, finding different modalities of incorporating those who are ready to cooperate with the EU on different areas and policies would actually be beneficial for the European Union. And it ties back to the question that Bridget had asked in the chat. That is, having these different modalities enables a much efficient way of dealing with the challenges that the European Union is facing, ranging from migration to, global governance to whatever. So membership might not necessarily be a, absolute prerequisite for cooperating with the EU. So my answer is, I think it's better to have, these kinds of at least organized, formalized forms of differentiation with the non-EU countries on the European continent to enable the European Union to be able to act much more efficiently to global challenges as well.
And thank you for picking up Bridget's question in the chat about reverse integration, reverse inspiration, and can we envisage the UK being a shaper of EU law to that extent? So perhaps, Nanette, you can also pick up the variant by Bridget on this question. Nanette.
Well, you said something, Kalypso, about cherry picking and to what extent that is allowed, because at some point the EU was suggesting that cherry picking wasn't allowed in the negotiations between the UK and the EU. But yet there is always some cherry picking. It's just that it is not always low-hanging fruit. So in general, in order to get something, you need to offer something in return. And here, the Canada example is quite instructive. This built upon and considerably expanded relations between Canada and the UK that predated the country's entrance into the EEC, into the European Economic Community. And this cooperation would later be considerably extended after an elaborate scoping exercise. A scoping exercise is a period of study and consultation preceding the negotiations between the parties, in this case Canada and the EU, with the objective of clarifying which subjects could be up for inclusion in the negotiations on either side. And this was done on the basis of consultation with all levels of government. It was then agreed not only to expand the scope of the existing relationship, but also to create an institutional structure allowing mutual regulatory cooperation and consultative partnership in the interest of both parties. By comparison, such a scoping exercise has always been absent in the case of the TCA with the UK. Negotiations were handled rather top-down by the UK government in the context of a deeply divided country, and the EU cannot do much about that. The UK is still a deeply divided country. More could perhaps have been done in the agreement. I leave it there because you wanted a short answer. I have a bit more to say on that as well.
Well, we'll continue the conversation with the chat. But I guess one could argue that this your argument about cherry picking, but not low hanging cherries. Basically, the metaphor is that countries have to jump high and work hard at this cherry picking. But one could perhaps argue that the UK's 47 years in the EU was a huge exercise in that in the scoping. So that would be the kind of functional equivalent of your Canada-EU scoping. At least maybe I would suggest that, which leads me back to either Jon-Erik or Christian, who would like to jump in at this stage for our last two comments before we turn to Joshua.
Yeah, I think.
Christian?
Yeah.
Yes?
And as I start and leave the last word to Jon-Erik, I think regarding cherry picking, the basic principles for external differentiated integration have not changed much over the last 3 decades. I think the EU still wants to protect the autonomy of its decision making and also of its legal order, and also to aims for an overall balance of benefits and obligation. And I also agree that the EU has been quite consistent with that. But on the other hand, I would also argue that the supply of differentiated integration is higher in the existing model of external differentiated integration than it was when negotiating such a model. And for instance, you can see that in the EA, where you have the small states like Iceland and Liechtenstein, which have a lot of opt-outs, which can benefit from the fact that they are not seen as a precedent by the EU, and that's why the EU allowed them so much opt-outs. But you can also see that Norway, they might not have permanent opt-outs, but they were repeatedly able to delay the incorporation of new EU acts, which were not fully in line with their preferences. So this is also some kind of a cherry picking. And here I would argue that external differentiated integration gives the EFTA states an institutional bargaining power that they didn't have had before they had this kind of agreement, and it makes it easier a bit for them to do cherry picking. And this brings me a bit back to the questions that was asked in the morning by John Pete regarding Brexit. And I think especially the EFTA states have played their card very well, in my view. On the one hand, they have always highlighted their commitment to the goals of the EA and to European integration. This is why the EU was never too critical about them. But on the other hand, they have used their leeway to accommodate at least some degree of differentiated within the internal market in an area where we have hardly any differentiated integration in the EU. So you can see that there is some kind of a possibility of cherry picking in the case of the EA, and you can also see that in the case of Switzerland, which has used this institutional bargaining power that it has by the already established bilateral way to negotiate an institutional framework agreement, which is, in my view, not fully consistent with the principles of the EU, and which is, in my view, very favorable for Switzerland. And yeah, that's why I think this threat of cherry picking is quite vital still.
But Christian, as Jon-Erik often likes to point out, and as you just said now, one big difference with the UK is that it's done most under the radar. It's not politicized. In fact, it's depoliticized to a great extent, although sometimes in Switzerland you have a bit of a flare-up of politicization. But probably we can't expect that in the UK case. We will always expect more visibility and flamboyant assertion of differentiation and sovereignty. I guess, Jon-Erik.
Thanks. First to Bridget, I know there are instances of the EU adopting measures also from non-affiliated non-members. I think also actually EU gender policy, it has drawn on the Nordic examples, and I believe both Norway and Iceland have been part of that. I think there might be also in, for instance, the electricity sector where there was an earlier move in, for instance, Norway. So I think if one goes sector by sector, one will find instances of the EU emulating from these affiliated non-members. The one thing I'd like to say is the reverse of cherry picking, and that is the fact that the EU in some ways is treating the EEA states especially as if they were economic members. And this is what is also interesting, what is pointed out by a legal scholar, Fredriksen. He says that in case 897-19 IN, the ECJ's Grand Chamber ruled that the EEA agreement protects an Icelandic citizen on vacation in an EU member state from extradition to a third state in the same way as EU law protects EU citizens in such situations. The CJEU states that Iceland has a special relationship with the European Union, which goes beyond economic and commercial cooperation. Now, this is interesting because it raises questions about the inside-outside type of status of these states themselves. And this goes also to a distinction, I think, that is relevant in this, and that is between those member states that qualify for membership and those that don't. And this also, I think, has bearings on a whole idea of differentiated external integration, that the EU is more might be more flexible also to those that qualify for membership. But at the same time, it also needs to be careful not to lower the bar too much, because that on one hand makes the change, this makes a significant disincentive for these states ever to become members. And of course, it can have ripple effects also on the other members in this. And if I can have 1 minute, just from what I understand from the EU's perspective, as a kind of, we did a report on the EU's external relations with non-members and tried to get the basic principles. And this comes also from the way in which the EU is reconfiguring sovereignty, not by moving sovereignty to the EU level, but by pooling and sharing sovereignty in common institutions. And that means that participation in EU institutions is the core. It's not border control as with a normal state. And I think this has a very significant bearing on the way in which the EU operates. So what the EU does then to those states that have declined participation in these common institutions, it still allows them full participation in the market. And there's a gradation in terms of this, but that comes based on conditionality, the logic of conditionality in the broad sense of sanctions and rewards, basically, for market access and other forms of access. So I think there is a logic to the way in which the EU structures its relations to external affiliated states that is related on one hand to the principle of conditionality and on the other hand to this understanding of participation, so that the more you are willing to embrace EU laws and rules, the more you have to expect obligations and also a system of sanctions. And I think the question in relation to Brexit was, to what extent should this logic be dominant in relation to Brexit, to the UK, or to what extent should the EU rather try to protect itself and let let its relation with the UK be devised through managing divergence rather than actually try to apply this type of principle. I think that from what we hear so far, it seems that they have opted for the second on managing divergence. But again, the reason why I brought up this informality and the adaptation and the fact that the UK already is EU program means that there is also a pull, not in functional terms, but maybe also to some extent in political terms, for a different type of dynamic. But that, of course, is for the future. Thanks.
Thank you, John Erik. And in a way, as academics, it is also our role to try to identify emergent patterns. We are at the very, very beginning. But I think what you've all said is that it is very idiosyncratic, Brexit. Nevertheless, there are lessons to be learned. And it's not always about the EU managing degrees of participation. In fact, I find it fascinating that the Brexit agreement, as you said at the very beginning, includes so much institutional structure under a single governance structure, etc., when the UK had protested very much that it wanted that second model, John Erik, that you just spoke of, conditionality and sanction. But in the end, perhaps the institutions have a power of their own. And all of these committees and committee structures, it will be fascinating to observe. And so on this note, and thanking all of you for this introductory roundtable, and we have 15 minutes left for questions, I'd like to turn to Joe Shaw. I mean, Bridget, are you happy with the answer to your question?
Yes, thank you.
Good. So Joe.
Thank you very much for giving me the floor, Kalypso, and I've learned a great deal from the two sessions this morning, so I'm very grateful for the invitation to join this very illuminating event. I think Nanette already picked up the point that that I wanted to emphasize and ask the speakers to reflect on a little bit. And she mentioned this notion that the UK is operating at the moment pretty much as a deeply divided society, and those cleavages are operating both in terms of how devolution is playing out in relation to Brexit and the withdrawal from the EU, but also in relation to this, many social issues as well, and people's perceptions of loss of freedom or loss of opportunity and so on and so forth. And that deep division, I think, has got to play through within British society. And I think many of us are still quite shocked in our process of understanding and processing all of what that means. But I'm wondering to what extent that deep division is going to impact not just on relations with the EU, but also relations with the types of close third countries that are represented on the round table, and whether or not the speakers have any reflections on how that might affect also not just, as it were, in a sort of a multilateral dynamic, also their own relationships with the UK as now also an EU third country.
I mean, Joe, I'm very tempted to ask you, from your deep involvement with the Scottish question, whether, in this whole picture of differentiated integration, if there was a positive vote for independence in Scotland, do you see an accelerated, re-entry into the EU? Do you see the EU, in fact, bending over backward to allow probably clauses of differentiated integration with Scotland rather than taking the whole package, given its relationship with England?
Well, that's right, because you've got the two huge questions of currency and border. So you've got to deal with those questions. Perhaps the currency issue can be dealt with in over a period of time, but I think the border issue is the very complex one, driving a sort of a Northern Ireland style rebordering process, if that doesn't sound too terrible, right across the center of an island. And I think we just don't know enough yet about how that can be coped with over a period of time. At the moment, there's a huge amount of politics being played around it, and part of the audience for that politics is clearly also not just people in Northern Ireland and people in Ireland and people in the EU, but the part of the audience is clearly the Scottish electorate as well. And I'm not sure whether or not people are paying that much attention to it, but it certainly does, perhaps along with also the Alex Salmond affair, seem to be having some impact on public opinion at the margins. So I mean, I wonder if that's the road, but I'm not confident by any stretch of imagination that Scotland would vote for independence at this stage. But it might do 10 years down the line, depending on how things have worked out. If things become either intolerable or more obvious what the solutions would be. At the moment, the solutions are being kept very opaque.
Absolutely, Joe, and I think nobody will try to predict on this one, but simply to ask whether the whole differentiated integration picture, will affect the expectations of the electorate in Scotland. But
it's hard to tell, because you really need a very well-informed public, don't you? But then then quite a sophisticated package was put before the electorate in 2014, and it did attract, I think, a lot more support than perhaps people expected at the beginning. So perhaps the Scottish electorate is capable of being reasonably sophisticated about these questions, and might also be assisted by processes like constitutional conventions and such like. Sorry,
thank you, Joe. I want to return to, but thank you for the insights, are very useful to the network. And I'd like to return to the roundtable and ask who would like to pick up Joe's question on the connection between the societal turmoil and the relationship with other third countries. John Erik.
Yeah, I should have mentioned in the earlier round also about as you said, Joe, Kalypso, the political sociology of this, I think, is extremely important. And one of the questions that has puzzled me is why are countries like Norway and so on living under these circumstances? And I think one aspect of, I mean, in terms of a democratic deficit we have, I mean, this is a very significant democratic deficit. So a pragmatic view on this would be to say that there is a significant social compensatory system in place. So that one of the things is that generous welfare states, they compensate losers from globalization and international agreements much more than what the UK has done. You've seen, I think that comes up also in the question on hostility towards immigration. It might not even have been direct hostility towards immigrants, but the fact that people were singled out as losers in Northern England and so forth, because there was no public system in place to protect them. So there is a clear socio-economic dimension in addition to the identitarian and regional dimensions in this. And of course, that brings up the question also about the TCA, how far that will push the UK in a more neoliberal direction beyond what we have seen in the EU. I mean, in that sense, there could also be a divergence. If the EU manages to consolidate more and push a socio-economic dimension, especially the social dimension from the pandemic, that this could be an important factor, or that this would come up again but I think we need, I mean, the Brexit debate has of course been about three dimensions. It's about identity, it is about the mode of affiliation, and it is about the socio-economic dimension. And the three are complicated, and to some extent, I guess there's a certain regional overlap. So there's a certain overlap, and maybe even amplification of some of these types of cleavages. And of course, you see that in Scotland, which is more social democratic than England is. So that, Joe is, yeah, okay. But at least they are more conducive to the Norway model, which is a more social democratic model than the general English model is, also in orientation. Okay, likes, I think it is, yes. But I won't hop on this, but I think that we need to look very carefully at this. And also, of course, what we also see is the gender dimension. This is important in this. It will come up, and the pandemic will make that very explicit, because of the fallout here is very gender specific of the pandemic. So it's also a question of to what extent the UK maintains the rights and so forth that have been gained in also from EU law and so on, to protect also gender equality in this. So I think the general aspects of rights will come up as well in this type of equation to generate quite a complex tapestry.
Yes, and of course, things are shifting very quickly in Britain in terms of a Keynesian Tories and keeping the Northern England in the warm embrace of this government. So I'm not sure that the neoliberal is so sustainable in the current environment. But I do want to encourage other questions, but also ask the roundtable. Who else would like to address this question, and including also what it implies for relationship with other third countries from Britain's viewpoint?
If I can say something, I think this, just to pick up a point of John Erik, I think this democratic deficit in the EA, this is a theoretical debate, and I think that people don't see that really, or at least in Liechtenstein or in Switzerland, they don't see it. And I think also as far as I know, the public opinion data in Norway. So that although there is definitely this democratic deficit, they don't see a gain of sovereignty when joining the EU. They don't see a gain of more influence when joining the EU. And I think this here we can really see that we have this past dependency, that they are really stuck in this model, and this is the only model, viable model for them. But I think coming to the relations, I think the Brexit will be a very inspiring case for Switzerland, and Switzerland is now really, there is a debate going on whether the model of Brexit will be a better model than this institutional framework agreement. And there is also a debate somehow going on, what kind of intense cooperations can Switzerland now have with the UK, especially regarding financial services and things like that. I think the Switzerland is also closer. Erik has mentioned the socio-economic dimension, and here Switzerland is much closer to the UK than Norway is actually to the UK in my view. And I think here in Switzerland it will be interesting how it turns out when they're when Brexit has settled a bit and is functioning well. What the Swiss debate will be then.
But now, Christian, you also raised what we could call the transitivity issue, that with a third country like Switzerland, but also we can turn to Nanette and Meltem for Canada and Turkey. So third country has a relation with the EU and the UK has a relation to the EU. What does it mean for the relationship between that third country and the UK? And can we square that triangle, as it were, that easily? Who controls the way in which one squares this triangle? Are there types of relationship between, say, Canada and the UK, or Turkey and the UK, Switzerland and the UK, that may make the EU uncomfortable because it only can shape each of these separate relationships? So can we say something about these triangles, where they're going, what they look like at this stage?
Can I?
Yes, Nanette or Meltem. Nanette, yeah. Nanette?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Nanette?
Yes, let me say something about Canada. I'm not sure one can say much about this. Canada has now twice rolled over the relations with the UK. So there's now this, in December, there was the second rollover with the Trade Continuity Agreement, also abbreviated as TCA, between Canada and the UK. And this is in actual fact only a very temporary agreement. So we don't know what's going to happen there. And in this context, I think it is regrettable that there was no scoping exercise in this context. Well, I regret also a little bit that you suggested that the scoping exercise can be dispensed with in the case of a member state that is leaving the EU, because there is an alignment that is already quite remarked, quite pronounced. So the scoping exercise is something which by definition looks at the future and not at the past. So I think it's an important exercise that cannot be dispensed with, but I leave it here because time is getting on. That's my contribution to this discussion. Maybe someone else wants to add something to it.
Thank you, Nanette. I want to turn to Meltem. Yeah, absolutely, on scoping exercise. It was a bit of a provocation here. Meltem.
Yeah, it's very quickly. The Turkish and the British governments had to negotiate a free trade agreement, but they could only do so when the European Union and the UK agreement was finalized. So there is a definite transitive, impact of the British exit from the European Union, because Britain was, something like number 4 or number 5 for Turkey's external partners, and similar for the UK. So they prepared for it. Once everything was finalized, there was a free trade agreement signed between the two parties. But the British-Turkish agreement now goes beyond the Turkish Customs Union agreement with the EU in multiple ways. Even though it's free trade agreement, it encompasses agricultural products that the Customs Union did not. So there is an attempt to make up for what has been lost with the British exit from the European Union by building a bilateral new type of a relationship. And it's probably going to expand furthermore in other areas as well. So that, I think, is the answer to your question with regards to the impact on third parties.
And that is fascinating. And we will ask in the future how the EU relates to these other bilaterals that impacts it in this way. John Erik, we've reached the time. It's 12:30. Would you like to share a last word on this issue? And then we will close. Martina has very rightly giving us the goodbye in the chat. But John Erik, I'd like to give you the last word here.
Oh, I'm happy. I think we can just continue tomorrow, and
wonderful.
And I'm very pleased with the chairing and the first session of this conference. Thank you.
Wonderful. You four were wonderful, and I'm sure there were other. And I'd like to ask everyone to clap and thank you for a great roundtable. Thank you. See you tomorrow.